Hello chess friends and welcome to Jozarov Chess channel and welcome back to the Computer Bullet Chess Championship in 2022. So far, as usual, Stockfish is in the lead, and I wanted to cover, of course, many games played by top engines, because they're playing many openings, and maybe you're interested in some opening lines and maybe in some variations of particular openings, maybe in some sidelines of also some other variations. As I said, I think these games are very important because we can include them into our opening repertoire. So I've sorted out now brilliant gameplay by Stockfish against another top engine of Rofchade in the French defense in this Winawer variation, in the advanced variation. I think it's a popular method to play the French defense from whites and from black's perspective. It's played many times by top grandmasters, and of course we want to see some wild continuations that are possible then for both sides. So let's check out now this game. I think again it's a tactical beauty, because in one particular moment you witness really a beautiful path by the rook. So the Stockfish will include its rook into the game really in a beautiful way. We'll play rook lift, and then the rook is dancing all over the board, will be included really in a fashionable way. It was, I think, again simply a beautiful tactical game played by the fish. So let's check out now this game. So here e4 was played by Stockfish. We have e6 by Rofchade, the French d4, d5, knight to c3, and after bishop to b4 we have now the Winawer variation, the spinning idea. So we have now the advanced variation with the move e5. Now we have c5, and after a3 we have reached now a position that has been played millions and millions of times. So now bishop to c3 and b takes c3. Okay, let's stop and evaluate a little bit position. Black gave up the bishop pair, which is sometimes not good, but at least black has a compensation for the lost bishop pair, has now this double pawn structure on the c file, has attention on dark squares, can play also queen to b6, and also we have to say the knights are very good in blocked pawn structures. What I mean about the blocked pawn structure is, of course, that we have now this collision 2 versus 2 here on in the center of the board. So that's why the knights are perfectly fine. And what we should notice also is the direction of the attack. Black is making many times progress on this side of the board, because the pawn chain is of course showing that black should attack on the queen side. On the other hand, white is trying to attack the king side. So these are tiny little strategies that we should know in the French defense. So after move b takes c3, we have knight to e7, we have queen to g4. We have now the so-called poison pawn variation, because many times when white takes the pawn on g7, white is facing many times tactical problems on the g file. So that's why it's called the poison pawn. But here the prearranged move was to move king to f8. And although it's a strange idea to protect the pawn like this, what you should not do, in my opinion, is to play g6. This is, in my opinion, not so good, because you gave up the dark square bishop in an early stage of the game. Now weaken the pawn structure like this and create dark square problems in the continuation of the game is not good. So when you give up a bishop in an early stage of the opening, then you should at least protect that squares that your bishop covers. So from this in this particular case, of course, these are dark squares, and that's why you should not allow your opponent to attack your dark squares. So that's why g6, in my opinion, too much riskier to play from black's perspective. So after move queen to g4, we have king to f8, we have h4, continue the pressure, because as we said, we know our direction of the attack. We know that we want to attack simply the king side. So here queen to c7, rook to h3. Stockfish protects now the c3 pawn also if something gets cleared. But actually what black should have played here and didn't play is the move c takes d4. Here Rofchade played h5, tried to attack the queen, but in my opinion c takes d4, and also my Stockfish engine at home suggests this move c takes d4, and then after something like c takes d4 to take simply this pawn on c2, and then to try to retreat the queen with the queen, because rook to d3 would be a must move. Bishop to d3 is not possible, because you get queen to c3, you have lost the connection here between the rook and the square c3, so you get the fork and you lose the rook. So that's why you have to play first rook to d3, and then if black develops with knight to c6, then you can of course play bishop to d2, and then with rook to c1 finally kick away the queen. And okay, white lost the pawn, we have to say it, but for the compensation for a beautiful piece activity, and now basically every piece of white is playing. White has a really great setup. Okay, but this is playable, I think, also here for black. But here in the continuation, as I said, after move rook to h3, instead of the move c takes d4, Rofchade played h5. So we have queen to g5, we have knight to c6. Again, probably c takes d4, much better here for black, but okay, here knight to c6, and after bishop to d3, now c takes d4 is not so dangerous because the queen is not attacking anymore the c file. So here in the continuation we have knight to f3, d takes c3, and now rook to g3, attacking the g7 pawn. So that's why black has to make now a reaction. Of course, knight to f5 is not working here because bishop to f5, e takes f5, queen to g7 leads into the disaster position for black. What you could do maybe is here to move g6, but as we said, this could be a risky choice. You weakening simply too much your dark square. Standing the continuation, probably queen to f6 will happen. You have to move the king in order to defend the rook, but now with a4 I think white is a solid game, with the idea of course to play bishop to a3 and then followed with bishop to d6. This would be a good piece for a good square for the bishop on d6, which would probably be then the best minor piece on the board. So as I said, in this scenario again, you're weakening simply too much your dark square. So here after move rook to g3, the Rofchade engine protected the position by playing knight to g6. We have bishop to g6, f takes g6, and after queen to g6, queen to f7. This was now a desperate try by the Rofchade engine to trade off the queens and simplify the game, because of course if we simplify the game by trading off the queens, then this game should probably end in a draw because of the fact that these are opposite colored bishops on the board, and when we have such a position, then many times the game ends with a draw. So that's why after move queen to f7, we have queen to d3, not allowing this scenario. We have knight to e7, and now knight to g5, attacking the queen. We have queen to e8, and now you look at this maneuver by Stockfish. Stockfish can play, of course, here immediately rook to f3, but now after move knight to f5, Stockfish maybe could sacrifice even here the rook, but it's risky because still this bishop is controlling the f5. We'll come to the f5 problem in the continuation of the video, because you'll see that basically the whole battle is around the square f5 now. But Stockfish played a slightly better move here. Instead of rook to f3 immediately, plays first knight to h7, then decoys the king of course to f7, now plays rook to f3, but now after knight to f5, knight to g5, now the king is on f8 again, and simply rook to b1. So you see now at least Stockfish gained an extra tempo by decoying the king now on another square, and improves now simply the activity of the pieces. Now the rook can be included here on the b file. You, for instance, if you try here b6 immediately to develop your light square bishop, as I said in the middle of the video, that here the move rook to f5 is many times a tactical possibility for white. So now after move e takes f5, you get queen to d5, and notice that the rook is hanging. You have to make a reaction. You have to play bishop to d7, but now with a4 and bishop to a3, the game is over for black, because the queen is cutting off escape route for the king, and now when the bishop comes on a3, this is game over. So this is something that bothers black, I think, the lack of development of the light square bishop. So you cannot play b6. This will be then a perfect position if you play b6, bishop to b7, then probably d4, and this is a good position for black. But now, as I said, with rook to b1, Stockfish is not allowing this types of ideas. So we have rook to h6, we have knight to h3, we have rook to h7, and now knight to g5. We had a couple of perpetuals, but now after knight to h3 and rook to h7, Stockfish played the third time now the move king to f1. So we have now b6, now rook to f5 is not working because of after e takes f5, you see the knight is not on g5 anymore, where it controlled the e6, where now after queen to d5 actually black can defend with the move bishop to e6. That's now the difference, because in the previous tactical sequence the knight was on g5 and you could not play the move bishop to e6. So now in this scenario black gets an extra tempo against the queen. So now this tactic is not working. I'm telling you about this tactic because it will be really the main story of this particular game. Here after move b6, Stockfish played a beautiful bishop to g5 move, and in the beginning of this video I didn't really pardon me, in the beginning of my analysis at home, I really didn't understand why Stockfish played the move bishop to g5, because I always thought that in French defenses and in similar structures, white should develop the dark square bishop by playing a4 and bishop to a3. But this seemed like a strange idea for me now, but actually this move is really brilliant, because this move is cutting off the square d8 for the rook. Many times now you see black will have the opportunity maybe to defend himself by playing rook to d8, but that's why this move bishop to g5 is important. It's not allowing the rook to come on d8. I'll explain you, of course, in the continuation why is it important, so important to cut off the d8 square, because here king to g8 was played. For instance, if you play d4 here immediately, this seemed to also me to like a reasonable idea here for black, because you have defended the d4 pawn, and the d4 is of course protecting the c3 pawn. But now comes the actual tactical stunner again. Rook to f5 is again a possibility now, because after e takes f5 we can play knight to f4. You cannot take out this pawn, that's the problem, because you get knight to g6, the fork, so you would be forced to play something else. You would be forced to play something like bishop to e6. But now, as we said, rook to b4 comes now really with a wild threat, rook to d4, and you see now you cannot include now the rook into the game. That's the beautiful idea here about this move bishop to g5. So as I said, this is simply Stockfish stuff. In the beginning sometimes we don't know why Stockfish is playing several moves, but now I think we have solved the mystery. I think with this idea rook to b4, look at this, you can maybe try rook to c8, but now with rook to d4, even if you try, I don't know, ideas like this, of course these are threats of c4, but we can immediately take and then rook to d8. So it's, I think, again game over here for black. So here in the continuation, after move bishop to g5, the Rofchade engine played the king to g8. We have king to g1, queen to f7, and now a4. We have bishop to b7, now a5, and here we have finally this move d4. Again, if you try b takes a5, you can guess what happens. Again, you have a rook to f5 as the main tactical shot, because if you try here e takes f5, you cannot take with the queen, of course, because the queen is connected to the defense of the pawn on b7. You have to take with the e pawn, but now e6 is trying to deflect, of course, again the queen from the defense of the b7 bishop. You have to play queen to c7, but now with knight to f4, I think white has a comfortable game. Again, this pawn is hanging, and again I'm pointing out that this square is taken for the rook, so it's really hard to defend the d5 pawn. If this pawn on d5 is lost, then of course also the king is naked. So also we have to say the rook is weird on h7, so a beautiful position here for white. So really the beautiful tactic. So after move a5, we have here d4 attacking the rook, rook to f4. We have now b takes a4, and now f3, cutting off here this diagonal for the light square bishop, and trying now to, of course, pretty much free with some other pieces. We have queen to c7, and you can guess what happens now. Now again, rook to f5. This was now the whole battle through the middle game stage for the f5 square. We have e takes f5, knight to f4, again with the same idea. We have g6, and now bishop to f6. So you see the bishop is now the best piece on the board. Finally, black has now problems on dark squares. As we said in the beginning, if you weaken the pawn structure too much, then the dark square bishop will probably be the best minor piece on the board. So after move queen to c5, we have knight to g6, taking out simply the pawn. We have bishop to c8, and now after move knight to f4, we have rook to f7, and now this rook comes really into the game in a beautiful way. Now look at this path: rook to b5, rook to d5, rook to d8. So it's really now getting more and more dangerous for black. So after move rook to b5, we have queen to d6, queen to c6, rook to d5. Look how this rook is dancing through the whole board. We have queen to a6, and now rook to d8. You have to cover yourself, because if you play something like this, you get rook to h8, a beautiful checkmate. So after move rook to d8, we have rook to f8, and now comes a stunning tactic, really immortal sacrifice here, rook to d7, because for instance, of course, black wants to trade off the queens here. That's not the point. So black wants to simplify the game by trading off the queens. But now with rook to d7, for instance, if you take bishop to d7, you lose the queen. So that's a huge problem. If you take the queen now, then of course you get checkmated. Here, rook to g7, king to h8, and then you get knight to g6. A beautiful, beautiful dirty checkmate here with the knight. So this is not working. So I have to move rook to d7, which was really, really a beautiful, stunning tactic. You have to play queen to f6. You have to sacrifice the queen. That's the only way to prolong the game. But now Stockfish simply takes, e takes f6, bishop to d7, and now queen to d4. Okay, we have now the queen for 2 rooks, but this is still an annoying pawn. This knight is also very annoying because it can attack the h5. There are also several checkmate threats here around the square g7, so this is now much better position here for white. Although when we count material, it should be about equal, but this is not how we should evaluate this position. It's a whole different story. The king is naked here by black. So rook from a to d8, we have queen to d5, the check, king to h7, we have f7, king to g7, and now first the check with knight to h5, king to h7, knight to f6, and here knight takes d7 was played by Stockfish. So we have here rook to f7. It seems so that maybe Rofchade can get back the piece, but now with a couple of checks, here Stockfish gets out of the mess and plays simply here knight to f6. So if you take, of course, rook to f6, then you get queen to c7, and the rook will be lost here on d8. So this is not working. So that's why this was a very important move, this move knight to f6. So that's why king to g7, but now queen to g5, and finally this rook can be protected. We have knight to h7, king to e8, queen to g6, and now after move king to e7, knight to g5, we have a check, and now queen to e6, again a new check, knight to f7, you have to sacrifice now the rook, queen to f7, and it's of course a completely winning endgame here. Rofchade tried to push the pawn, but now Stockfish can get the queen behind, takes another pawn, then simply push the pawn further here, h7, now a check, sacrifice the queen, but again we can promote a new queen. Now Stockfish just pushed the pawn further, new queen gets promoted, and now this was, after a couple more moves, a beautiful checkmate here on a3. So really stunning tactics. Again, I really loved this move. Let's go back. This move, rook to d7. This was, I think, an immortal tactic with so many tactical opportunities. You cannot take the queen, you get checkmated. You cannot take the rook, you lose the queen. So again, really brilliant stuff by the fish. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I really enjoyed it a lot. The interesting ideas of the Winawer variation of the French defense. If you want to see more brutal attacks like this, check out my commented chess games played by computer series with some more games played by Stockfish, Alpha Zero, Lila Zero, and many more. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.